It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Vickers, Labour peer and former Cabinet Minister David Blunkett, former Special Advisor Anita Boateng and Daily Mirror political editor Pippa Crerar. Today, ministers announce more tests for all travellers entering the UK.
We also need to put in place all the checks we can to make sure that we don't get these new variants.
The Health Secretary will be announcing details in the Commons shortly. Campaigners say genocide is taking place in these detention centres in China. MPs want to let the courts decide.
It will be inconceivable for any UK parliamentarians to vote against this important bill that has been considered.
But the government's been accused of playing games to stop today's vote. That's the sound of a wartime bomb being destroyed at sea. Actress and campaigner Joanna Lumley says it's harming marine life. She'll tell us why she wants Boris Johnson to act. We're going to start today's programme with the news that in about 15 minutes' time, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, will stand up and talk about a new policy that's expected to say all travellers into the UK from abroad will have to take 2 COVID tests on days 2 and 8 of their self-isolation, either at home or if they've flown into the UK from a red list country, then in the hotel that they are quarantining in. And that's on top of a test that they have to take 72 hours before they actually fly. Now, we have only broadly totted up the cost for a family of 4 if they were coming back from abroad from holiday. It will probably cost in the region of £2,000 or so added to the overall bill. Pippa, you're not allowed to travel abroad at the moment anyway to go on holiday, but if you could, would that be enough to put you off?
Yes, absolutely, particularly because obviously you're paying for the holiday itself and indeed all these other extras. But the government has quite rightly said that travelling abroad is not what anybody should be doing right now. We shouldn't even be travelling around the country. The big question, though, is whether the measures in place at the border are enough to prevent new mutations of the virus come in. About 12,000 people are still arriving every day. And there's a lot of concern on the backbenches amongst the Conservatives and, of course, on the Labour front bench that the measures that Matt Hancock's going to announce today, which are testing, as you say, but I understand will go a bit further and set out some of the hotel quarantine plans as well, are not going to be strong enough to do that.
Right. Well, Anita, at the moment, would it be enough to put you off if you could go abroad?
If I could go abroad, I think it would probably just about be enough, but not really because of the cost, but more because of the logistics required around this. But it's worth us refocusing exactly on why Matt Hancock has brought this in. And that's really about getting on top of the new strains. And it cannot be stressed enough how big a role the UK has played in identifying these new strains, which is going to be vital in tackling the virus in the next months to come.
Right. Well, it's put you two off, or pretty well. And David and Matt, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. But it's interesting because lots of people, it seems anecdotally, haven't been put off so far. Let's talk to Lisa Mino, travel editor at The Sun. Lisa, just before I talk to you, I'm just going to show everybody this tweet from the TUI group of travel agents. Positive outlook. People want to travel. 2.8 million bookings for summer 2021. Capacity planning still 80% of summer 2019 programme. Now, they would say that, I suppose, wouldn't they? But people are clearly hopeful, aren't they, Lisa?
Yes, of course, they are hopeful. I mean, I think it needs to be stressed as well that a lot of people had their holidays cancelled last year, and those who took refund credit notes or vouchers will have rebooked for this year. So that number would include a lot of people who are really, they've lent their money to this travel company for the last year, and they will really want to be getting away.
Right, but in terms of today's announcement, which I've sort of broadly outlined, do you think that will give people pause for thought?
I think it very definitely would. I mean, we're hopefully talking about this happening. This is going to come in quite soon, this testing, double testing. But that is going to put people off taking a week's holiday in Spain. I mean, it really would triple the cost of a holiday if you had to add on those 3 coronavirus tests, as well as one to perhaps get into a country that you're travelling to.
Right, but are people gambling on how long these measures will be in place? Do you think there is a general feeling that people wanting to go abroad think, it'll be over by then?
I think it's more wishful thinking than anything else at the moment. I mean, at the start of the year, when we had the vaccination programme first rolled out, there was a degree of optimism that by the summer we could return almost to normal. But as we've seen these new variants come in and the worrying statistics that have come along with those, I think there's much less confidence now that the summer is going to be somewhere where we can head abroad. I'd love to say we are. I'm desperate to get away myself. But I think really, with the government not even saying that they're convinced UK holidays will be happening by the summer, it is a big risk to take.
Lisa, thank you very much. David, is there a real disconnect here between what people think is going to happen with that 2.8 million bookings to go abroad? Triumph of hope over experience?
No, I think they're right. I'm sorry to be perverse, but I actually don't think this doom and gloom will do us any good at all. I'm very clear that so long as we have high levels of death rate and there are real worries about the variants, then the actions that are being announced today are perfectly reasonable. I have this quirk of always thinking, what would I do if I was still in government? And I have to say to my own front bench, I wouldn't try and do something that was simply impossible to achieve. You could not put into hotels the vast numbers of people, even with the restrictions, who are coming in. You can test before they leave, you can test when they arrive, you can quarantine them and isolate them and test. But we can't put everybody into hotels who come, unless you're going to close down the whole of our borders, the whole of our world connectivity. If you do that, you don't just kill the aviation and airports, you don't just reduce the capacity to be able to bring in freight and to undertake trade, but you actually also cut yourself off economically from the rest of the world. And I just think people need to take a deep breath. What is the objective? The objective is to reduce the infection levels and the spread. The objective is to stop the deaths in hospital. And once we've got a grip of that, we should try to get back to normal. I'm booking a holiday in Italy at the end of July. I have every intention of going.
All right, well, we'll hold you to that. Come back in the summer and we'll see if you're heading off to Italy. Matt, listening to that, should the government be more optimistic?
I think the thing with this thing is it's there's so many variables. We're responding to infection rates, responding to changing variants of the infection. Actually, yes, there's a cost involved in putting everybody through 3 tests. No one's going on holiday at the moment. The vaccination program's going great guns, and we should be looking forward to getting those doors open, getting back on holiday, and making it all happen. Actually, these 3 tests, the key to these 3 tests is they're not only adding that line of defence, but they're about letting us track what's coming into the country, track any new cases, and giving us a greater opportunity to detect those new cases. The UK has contributed massively to detecting the new variants and understanding the new variants. I'm sure we'll continue to play that part.
Right. Will you book a holiday abroad for the summer?
I'd love to book a holiday. I haven't quite got around to it yet. Italy sounds quite exciting, David. Yeah, I look forward to being able to go on holiday, and I'm sure, I'm optimistic, upbeat, can't wait to get away, and I'm sure this vaccination programme will continue to be a great success.
All right, well, we'll leave it there for the moment because MPs are going to be voting today on something called the Trade Bill. Now, Rebel Tory MPs and the opposition want to vote on an amendment that would give the High Court the power and the right to rule on whether a country is committing genocide. Now, things haven't quite gone to plan for the opposition and the Rebel group of MPs. Pippa, what's happened?
Well, as you say, the Rebel Tories, quite a large number of them, some quite prominent names, including people like former leader Ian Duncan Smith, wanted to back this House of Lords amendment, which would have forced ministers that wanting any free trade agreement with a country that the High Court rules has conducted genocide, it would prevent them from doing that. Ministers wanted obviously to overturn this measure today, but they faced the problem of the fact that this amendment was going to be voted on by these rebels. And last time, their majority was reduced to just 11. So with more Tory support, it could have got over the line today. So instead, they've done two things. First of all, they proposed a compromise amendment under the name of Bob Neill, who's the chair of the Justice Select Committee. And the idea behind that one is that it would give MPs in Parliament the power in the form of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and then the Lords, the equivalent committee, to make a decision on whether or not they regarded genocide as being committed, or at least to sort of have that discussion. But what they've done is, in order to make sure that MPs back that amendment and not the other one, the Alton amendment, is they've done what's called bundling it with a third amendment. Now, by bundling two amendments together, it means that MPs, it's a parliamentary advice, it means that MPs will only get one vote, but it will apply to both of those. And the problem for lots of those Tory rebels is that bundled amendment is a Labour-backed one, which would impose a human rights audit before any trade deals were signed, which they wouldn't ordinarily support. So if they want their amendment, they need to back that too. So de facto, pushing probably some of them away from backing it, and the government hopes that they'll support the Bob Neill amendment. However, I think they've got a fight on their hands on this one. I really do. Well, let's find out if they have and talk to one of the rebel Tory MPs. Imran Ahmed Khan joins us now. What's your response to what some of your colleagues are calling sort of low-level parliamentary tactics by the government here?
Well, good afternoon, Jo. I think it's rather disappointing. There's clearly a desire across the House to have a vote on the Genocide Amendment. And the government managers can wrap it up in whatever elegant sounding excuses they wish, but it comes to the same thing. We're being denied a democratic vote on something as important as genocide. Now, I'm a true blue Tory, patriotic through and through and loyal to my party. But I must say, my love of party is trumped by my love of humanity. And genocide is not a game that we should be playing party politics with. So I find it deeply disappointing. Why is it so important, this amendment? I mean, you're saying your love of humanity trumps the love of your party. What's at the heart of this? Humanity. And it is important. You know, personally, before I got into Parliament, I spent many years working overseas in war zones, and I saw evil close up. And one of the reasons that I was prompted into going into Parliament was because I swore I would do whatever I could to stymie the growth of evil and to help bring what little I could to bring peace and succour to those in need. And this is aimed very much at the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur minority, isn't it? Well, you may say that. It's aimed at genocide everywhere. I mean, I'm not particularly old, I'm 47. But in my life, we keep on saying never again. Yet in my lifetime, we've seen genocide in Rwanda, the Yazidi genocide, East Timor, Darfur, Bosnia, the Rohingya. And now, unfortunately, it does seem we're seeing it as well with the Uyghur people. Right. But what about now? What can you do about what the government has effectively done, which is stopping this vote and stopping you getting your amendment through? Well, in the end, what I'm hoping that my colleagues will do across the House is vote against the Neill Amendment, which is the government's backed amendment, which in itself is a dead parrot. It reminds me of the Monty Python sketch. Both House of Commons and House of Lords committees, who they wish to adjudicate, have rejected it and dismissed it. It is a dead parrot. It goes against long-standing UK government policy, which says that genocide is a legal determination that is to be determined by responsible courts, and that's all we're trying to do. The government is backtracking on its own long-term policy. So if the House votes against the Neill Amendment, then the Lords can propose a amendment again. All right. And so we'll get another day. All right. Imran Ahmed Khan, thank you very much for joining us. Matt, what is your response here? Why is the government trying to stop this amendment going through when it's so important in the way that's just been described?
I think first we've got to talk about how fantastic it is that, you know, the trade bill is on there, is happening, it's going on. The EU plus 64 other countries signed up to trade deals worth £889 billion. But on the genocide issue, you know, what is happening in China is deeply concerning. The country has to do something about it. But you know what? The UK has played a leading role in holding China to account. We're leading statements on the UN's human rights bodies. We're engaging directly with China's authorities at senior levels. But it's also slightly absurd to assume that any government will wait for human rights situations to get to the point where it's a genocide before halting free trade agreement. You know, it comes long before that. And actually, any responsible government is not going to sign up to free trade agreements in such a scenario. But we don't need to wait to reach the awful level of a genocide. Actually, long before that, involved in any discussions like this, we should be saying no to partners like that. So I think it's probably the wrong place for the judiciary to be making such decisions. The government can be trusted to make such decisions. Any reasonable government will not enter into free trade agreements with anybody who's conducted anything like those atrocities. And as I understand it, in terms of this amendment and the way it's gone, I understood it was a procedural thing, and it was the Speaker who lumped it together. But actually, I think everyone's right. Parliament will have its say. If it is the will of Parliament, this shouldn't happen. There are processes that will allow that to be put back and debated again, and I'm sure we'll hear all about it this afternoon.
Right, well, David, before you answer what your view is, because it will probably come back to the House of Lords and you will have a chance to vote on this, we're going to show some pictures that are purporting to be from a detention camp in China where Uyghurs have been mistreated over a number of years. But in your view, is it right that the courts should make a decision effectively on government trade policy?
Well, they already have powers, partly in relation to our trading arrangements. My instincts are always that Parliament should decide these things. I've got no doubt whatsoever that the Uyghurs are being incredibly badly treated, that they're enslaved and abused. I think the issue of genocide is another matter. I think the two amendments that Pippa referred to, I voted for the Labour amendment in relation to human rights. And I abstained on David Alton's amendment, which we've been talking about just now, because I do actually think that if Parliament has the evidence and believes that there is genocide in any country that we trade with, it should be Parliament that decides that that trade should cease and that the inward investment in our country should cease. I don't believe that passing it off to the High Court is either appropriate or in a democracy the right thing to do. Now, I'm on a bit of a limb here because the Alton Amendment was passed overwhelmingly, because the minute you mention genocide, why wouldn't people want to vote for the High Court to make a judgment? My answer is, well, if you really believe it and you have the evidence, for goodness sake, put it to Parliament, not to the High Court.
Anita, the government obviously feared it was going to lose today. It's in a tricky situation, but is it behaving in the right way over this issue?
I think it's enormously challenging for the whips. And I think that actually this is a long-standing challenge for the government to kind of really improve its communication and relationship with backbenchers in order that this is not the situation that arises. I agree with a lot of what Lord Blunkett has said, particularly around like the practical effect that this legislation would have. And I think the instincts of the government are probably right in that actually it really is something that ought to be political decisions. And ultimately, we're not staring down the barrel of a trade deal with China. So I can see how the government has arrived at this. I can also see how MPs feel like there's a need for them to do much more and to really toughen up the response that the UK has to what's happening in China, which is absolutely atrocious.
All right, we're going to move on and talk about vaccines. Well, we're going to start off talking about the vaccines. Pippa, we're going to show the headline story in your paper, which the headline, Over 70s are told, time to call the shots. This is the story that over 70s who haven't been contacted yet to come and have their coronavirus vaccine should get in touch with the NHS. And it comes as over 12 million people have received immunisation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, then, an Ipsos Mori poll from yesterday, which asked people to gauge what the government's reaction, or their reaction, sorry, to the government's performance on the vaccine is. Overwhelmingly, we're showing our viewers here, good job, 86% in ensuring the UK has a coronavirus vaccine. Pippa, do you think the government's going to get a vaccine bounce in the polls from this?
Yes, almost certainly in the short term. And I don't think, I mean, I'd be one of those 86% who are delighted that the vaccine rollout's gone so well, down, of course, to government ministers to the vaccine task force for getting the vaccine doses agreed, the contracts agreed, and primarily to the NHS and its brilliant rollout of jabs across the country, across the most vulnerable. So, I think it's something that after what's been a really tough time for everybody, lockdowns and uncertainty and conflict over rules and losing relatives in some cases to coronavirus, it has offered us all a sort of a bit of a hope that there might be an exit to all of this. At least the vaccine should play a major part in that. So it's inevitable, I think, that people will be delighted that this part of it's gone so well. I think what's really interesting is that it kind of does offer the government a second chance. I mean, I think the general consensus, Matt may disagree, but the general consensus across the country was that there were many, many mistakes made during the first part of the pandemic, and the handling of all sorts of different issues, from the testing and tracing system to the initial procurement of PPE, crucially to the delays in decisions to bring lockdowns in and follow the scientific advice by the Prime Minister, has led to this feeling that the government didn't handle that aspect of it well. So if it does this bit, it provides sort of the exit strategy, if you like, and gets on top of that, and it looks like they are going to hit the 15 million target of the most vulnerable being vaccinated by next week, then that will give them the opportunity to sort of, recast the narrative as though it's been a success. How that long that will last, I don't know, because we're obviously going to be then into the economic fallout.
Yeah, well, that's the question I want to put to Anita. I mean, how long do you think it will last? Will it be short-lived? I mean, can the government really rely on a bounce in the polls from the vaccine programme? Other things could go wrong. There's plenty of time, particularly over quarantine policy.
You're not sounding very optimistic, Jo.
Realistic, maybe.
I think that we've seen quite a lot of Labour briefing that there's going to be a vaccine bounce, partly because they know that the local elections coming up may not be the resounding success that they would perhaps have hoped for a year ago. And I think that's actually much more about Labour's shortcomings and its inability to really define what it would do as a government in waiting. But on the question about the government's fortunes, I think we have to see polls as a snapshot rather than a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. And I think that what we've seen through the past year is a lot of sympathy from the public about the level of challenge and the level of stress that the government has been under to deliver in an unprecedented climate. So I think that we're seeing a mature electorate that's understanding that actually a lot of new science has been coming out almost on a monthly basis. And so I think that something the government can control, such as vaccines, is something that rightly, it's being recognised for, but it's not even nearly over. We may see, yet more strains of the virus, for instance, that really changes what the government can do in terms of unlocking in the next sort of 6 months. So it's really not over yet.
Well, David, Anita mentions Labour's fortune. I'm just going to show everybody part of an article that Rachel Reeves, Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, has done with the New Statesman. In her interview, she's sort of making a historical comparison with World War II. In 1945, nobody, she says, thought that Churchill had done a bad job as war leader, but they didn't think he had the answers for the future. They thought that Labour did. They wanted to create a fairer and more equal society after the war. Do you think that's what's going to happen, that Keir Starmer will be seen as the man in this case to sort of lead the post-pandemic era?
Well, I think we all like a bit of optimistic nostalgia. I think we've got a long, long way to go in the next 3.5 years, partly for what's just been described, the success of the vaccine and the expertise of scientists, and yes, the government's future purchasing, which has worked very well, has overwhelmed the feelings about the corruption, the nepotism, the way in which cronyism has affected the purchase of equipment and test and trace. And by the way, the obvious fact that every day you see the Prime Minister or senior government ministers doing the press conferences on television, radio, whatever, in a way that is not available to the opposition. And here's another little rub. This government, a very, very right-wing government, have been carrying out social democratic policies. They've abandoned the idea that the state is the problem and realised that the state is the solution. They've implemented the borrowing in order to save jobs and to invest in the vaccine. And we all applaud that. But it's actually as much as a Labour policy as it ever would be a Boris Johnson policy. So I think we've got some very interesting contradictions going on. It's going to be a major challenge for Keir Starmer and the front bench to work their way through this and to provide a real genuine alternative once we get out of this to when we came into it with austerity.
Right, well, Matt, have you become a Social Democrat?
I don't think so. But the vaccine rollout has been a huge success for this country. We heard from all those who suggested being involved in the European vaccination programme would be, that's where we needed to be. It wasn't the case. But we owe a huge debt of gratitude to all those people in the NHS, our primary care network, volunteers, local. It's been a great British effort. It hasn't been a politician's effort. It's been led from the front by the public sector, the private sector.
But to David's point, that you have inhabited and are inhabiting sort of social democratic policies when it comes to public spending, when it comes to state intervention. That's what's happened to this Conservative government.
I think we're making a decision on a case-by-case basis. We understand the people that we represent. We listen to them. You know, I mean, when you look at the
or is it because it's the right thing to do?
Well, everything we do is the right thing to do, we hope, and that's why we're doing it. But I don't think when we talk about polling numbers, these polling numbers aren't necessarily a vaccine boost, in my view. They're actually about the fact people are wising up to the fact that you've got two parties. One is day in, day out, making tough decisions to get this country turned around and fixed, and the other sat talking about how to trick voters into thinking they're patriotic. And when it comes to seats like mine, the current Labour Party, they don't share the values of people in my part of the world. This talk about plans to use veterans and use the flag, it stinks and it doesn't work, and people can see through it.
All right, well, David.
Well, I'm not bothered about accusations of that sort. The Labour Party is going to win. It's going to win because people believe that we're on their side and that we're doing the right things for the future and not just for the past.
Right. I mean, in terms of that focus group evidence, though, David, on patriotism and concentrating more on veterans, and I think the third thing was dressing smartly, are these the sorts of values that will win back seats like Matt's?
Well, I was told by Peter Mandelson a very long time ago to dress smartly. I didn't need him to tell me, by the way. I didn't need anybody to tell me to be a patriot. So I think we just need to get back to fundamentals, to what the Labour Party was and will be about. And it's all about the challenges of tomorrow, which are going to be absolutely enormous in terms of inequalities that have been thrown up and identified during the pandemic, but which will remain with us in substantial measure. And that's about the future of people's jobs, about the future of our education system and recovery. It's about ensuring that our NHS is never put in the position again, as it has been over the last 10 years, where austerity has bitten into all the preventive measures that would have prevented the pressures that have existed on the NHS during the pandemic. We know that, experts know it. Last time I was on your programme, Michael Marmot, the expert in these areas, was describing it. It's still here today and it will be here tomorrow.
Anita?
It's really telling, Joe, that you described that, wearing a suit, etc., as strategy. I think it's all tactics and no strategy. And the problem that we have from Labour is that it hasn't really taken a single risk since Keir Starmer became leader. It hasn't taken a punt, even like Tony Blair did, and said, actually, you should have a single dose strategy, vaccinate everyone with one dose and then get to the others, to the second dose once you have more of the vaccine in the country. And that lack of risk and that lack of saying what you would really do in the pandemic has meant that every single criticism has looked like hindsight. And if you're a government in waiting, you can't just be sat there waiting for the government to mess up. You have to say what you would do. And I'm not sure that Keir Starmer is going to be able to overcome that weakness in the months and years to come.
Pippa?
Well, it's a very conservative characterisation of it. I mean, on the other hand, you could look at what Keir Starmer has said at PMQs about 2 or 3 weeks often before Boris Johnson then went ahead and made an announcement and considered it foresight rather than hindsight. I mean, bottom line is Labour has got a long way to go. They had a historic election loss a year ago, and only now a level pegging in the polls, which actually, by some measures, is about as far as they could come after only less than a year as Labour leader under Keir Starmer. They've got a long, long way to go. They needed to try and detoxify the brand. They're still on that path, I think. They've now got to start, Anita's right, setting out some ideas for the future. They need to persuade people that the Conservatives are tired. What Boris Johnson did so well was try and convince the public that he was in fact a new administration, when in fact they have, as David says, been in power since 2010 and have got the legacy of austerity hanging off their shoulders. But they also need to have answers for the future, and that, I suspect, will come in the next stage of Keir Starmer's plan to get a bit closer to government.
All right, we're going to leave it there and move on and welcome Joanna Lumley to the programme, actor and campaigner on everything from the rights of former Gurkha soldiers to live in the UK to a variety of environmental campaigns and, of course, her wonderful travel programmes. Joanna, just before I talk to you, I'm just going to show our viewers what you are campaigning on right here and now, something called Stop Sea Blasts. Take a look at this. Ooh. Joanna, tell us what's going on here exactly.
Well, I couldn't see that clip, bless your heart, but I know exactly what it was. Was that
Good.
The big explosion? I think it was the big explosion you were showing.
It is, and
yes.
It was.
And this is all to do with offshore wind farms, which I support absolutely. And I know that we're all tied into 4 times more wind farms being built around the coast in the next 10 years. What happens is that they have to clear the seabed so that they can put the great rigs up. And about 100,000 tons of munitions from the First and Second World War lie on the seabed, and they have to be destroyed. At the moment, people what they're doing is that they're clearing them by blowing them up, which has catastrophic effects on marine life. Because first of all, it damages the auditory systems of whales and dolphins and those big sea mammals. Secondly, it kills millions of fish. Thirdly, it damages the seabed. And it's terribly disruptive. Now, there is a new system, well, it's not new because it's been used for years, which is called deflagration, which is firing a little cone into the bomb, let's call it, which then burns the bomb out from the middle and is 100 times quieter, far less damaging. It's available. It's widely kind of given the nod from both DEFRA, the government, and the great power companies. But for some reason, it hasn't been active. It hasn't been put into play. And we're just saying every time more of these armaments are cleared, the damage to sea life is catastrophic. Why can't we turn it around now?
I mean, people might think, Joanna, that those events, the one that we just showed our viewers that you didn't see, but the explosion there in the sea, is actually quite rare. I mean, is it actually quite common then?
Yes, it is common. Well, it has to be common because they're putting these offshore wind farms all over the place. And it's not just us, it's off the coast of Germany, off all over the place where the bombs have been dropped during the last war. They've got to clear the seabed to make the bases stable. And so it's happening. Now, quite often these are happening out at sea. We don't see them, and so we don't. The sea is so huge, we don't know that anything can possibly ever go wrong with it because it's so colossal, covers 3/4 of the ocean. But these are terrible, terrible things to do to these huge and valuable creatures and fish, which are killed in their millions and then are useless. And of course, this new thing is that they can, once they've detonated it so quietly, deflagrated it, they put down something which I'm going to call rather foolishly a shrimping net, and they collect up all the debris and can take it away. Now, the big explosions disperse this devastating debris all over the thing, where it gets into the food chain. The fish eat it, larger fish eat it, and it works its way back into anything that eats fish, which includes us.
Now, what about the support that you've got for the campaign? I understand that you've written to the Prime Minister and Carrie Simons about this. Have you had a response? What are you hoping for them to do?
Not yet. They're busy. I understand they haven't had a response yet. But the feeling is generally is that there's nobody against this. You see, we haven't got an enemy. It isn't as though we're fighting somebody. We're saying everybody knows about this. But rather than standing around sagely in a circle going, yes, I think this could work. A lot of people saying, I think this could. But somebody's got to stand forward and say, well, let's make it work. It's now got to become mandatory that the first thing you do. Sure, some things might have to use the big explosion techniques, but most of them can be deflagrated, which is far better. Why don't we do something that is simple? It costs the same. It's as easy to use. It's just that it's old customs.
So it's a mindset. It's a sort of mindset thing.
Exactly that.
OK, well, look, let's put some of this to our panel. And we are going to actually ask them for their reaction in just a moment. But are you hoping later on this year, Joanna, to return to some of your travel programmes and travel logs?
So much. It depends on where in the world we can go. It seems that we were planning last year to follow the spice route from the Far East right across down to Egypt. And of course, that was cancelled. We hope to be able to pick that up this year, and I don't think we can. But we will continue. I'm hoping perhaps to go to Europe, our beloved Europe, and see, you know, our great, fabulous area, which is Europe, which of course we still are part of, no matter geographically, no matter politically where we are, we're still part of it. And I want to send a love letter to Europe, say we love you. I want to sing Bette Midler's song, you know, we will always love you.
Please, go ahead, sing it for us. I guess they're desperate for you to sing it. I mean, I suppose there's a hope that with the vaccination programme being rolled out, that maybe you might be able to return later in the year to Europe.
I hope so, and it's going to be interesting to see whether we do actually get vaccination passports, because we don't know. I mean, here they say get a doctor's letter. Well, that's going to be really difficult because all the surgeries are under such pressure that people like me saying, oh, by the way, could you write a letter saying I've had the jabs? I think that in some way we've got to be able to have a simpler system. I would have it in either the health passports we have, which I've got one which shows all the yellow fever, rabies, all the things, or you have it marked in your own passport so that it's quite easy for whichever country you're visiting to say, they've been done, tick.
Well, Joanna, come back and tell us how you get on with the campaign. And I'm going to put it now to our guest. But thank you very much for joining us. Joanna Lumley there. Matt, listening to what Joanna was saying, should it be mandatory? Should there be a change in the law on this issue of stopping sea blasts?
I think first up, it would be completely amiss of me not to recognise the amazing, wonderful campaigning force that Joanna is, bringing awareness to issues that otherwise the world might miss. Hugely important issues. I think I agree. I understand that that BEIS are currently looking, researching low deflagration techniques, and are actually in consultation with marine management organisations and conservation bodies to look at something that's safe and effective. And I think it's entirely right that the issue's raised, and I think without amazing campaigns like Joanna, we might miss it.
Right, well, David, apart from perhaps you and Joanna going to Italy later on in the year, if that's at all possible, what about the idea of this stopping sea blast? It doesn't sound like anybody is against it. So is it a simple thing to change, do you think?
I know nothing about it. I have to say, I'm totally convinced by Joanna, and I wish her well with the campaign. If technically it can be done, it should be done. And by the way, it's not just her travel programmes, but there's a great Radio 4 programme called Conversations from a Long Marriage with Roger Allen. And if Joanna's listening, it's a great programme.
Oh, right. Well, there you go. Good promotion. She's gone now, but I'm sure she'll thank you for it. Anita, on the Stop the Sea Blasts.
I agree. I think we have to commend Joanna for this amazing campaign and for teaching me an awful lot about it when I didn't know a huge amount. And I think that there actually really is a lot of grounds for optimism in this space in particular. The Conservative Environment Network is much bigger than it was, and that's a group of MPs that really want more proactivity and more action around protecting the environment. And I think you can find no greater allies than amongst the Conservative backbenchers. So I really would urge her on with the campaign and to get more MPs involved, as well as the Prime Minister and DEFRA and BEIS, in seeing what more can be done.
Pippa?
Well, this is a matter that is close to the heart of Carrie Symonds, the PM's partner. So if anybody can convince him, she can. I mean, we've already seen in recent years his sort of his reincarnation as a sort of green-minded environmentalist, whereas I can remember certainly not that long ago he was actually rather rude about things like wind farms. I think it's brilliant that the government is keen to press ahead with a strategy of renewable energy. I think that's essential for not just for the future environmentally, but also in terms of investing in new infrastructure, new technology in the UK and being at the forefront of all of that. And of course, the environmental aspect brought up, mentioned by Joanna. I mean, I think I was reading an article about this. I think there's 50 destinations every year in UK coastal waters, but there's 100,000 mines and bombs thought to be in our seas. Potentially, some of them obviously would have to be removed if we are going to expand this green wind farms programme. So it's inevitable that there'll be fallout from that. So if deflagration works, again, I'm not an expert on it, then it seems to make sense to look at it properly and to try and minimise the environmental harm that they do at the same time.
Well, I said at the beginning of the programme that we might try and bring you some of Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary from the Commons, which we will do so now. Here he is.
We'll be putting in place tough fines for people who don't comply. This includes a £1,000 penalty for any international arrival who fails to take a mandatory test, a £2,000 penalty to any international arrival who fails to take the second mandatory test, as well as automatically extending their quarantine period to 14 days, and a £5,000 fixed penalty notice, rising to £10,000 for arrivals who fail to quarantine in a designated hotel.
David, what do you make of what sounds like pretty tough fines if you fail to comply with these tests while you are either self-isolating or quarantining in a hotel or at home?
Well, there's no point in having measures if you don't enforce them, and that's been the problem. You can announce whatever you like, but unless you actually carry it through in practice. So I'm not against the fines. I'd be very strongly in favour of putting in place mechanisms so you can actually catch those who are disobeying the rules that are now being laid down.
Right. I mean, the enforcement slightly confuses me here, Matt. How will people know if everyone is taking these tests if they're at home?
I think, well, we're becoming much better at being able to do that, haven't we? We've got the app, we've got it all going on. The reality is it's all about quarantine. We've got to assume that people are going to be compliant in some way, shape or form. You know, that's why we've got this home quarantine. People are quarantining at the moment. People are handing over their address and telling you where they're going to be located for the duration of the time.
Oh, I think we just lost your sound there just at the end. Pippa, what's your reaction to these quite stiff fines? Will it mean that the policy will work?
Well, as David says, it absolutely comes down to enforcement. I mean, there's fines of up to £10,000 for escaping hotel isolation, £2,000 for failing to take a test in isolation. And then, of course, the jail sentences for passengers who lie about where they've been. Now, there's no doubting that those are very tough. But there are lots of MPs that think, actually, given that our case rate is still so high, and a policy like, you know, almost entirely closing off borders to passengers works best when the case rate is low, they would prefer enhanced testing, you know, GPS tracking, COVID passports. Joanna mentioned them. Other European countries have them, and crucially enforcement. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the police say about the support that they're getting in order to be able to make these to make these arrests ultimately, and to impose these fines on people. Because whether it works or not, whether the fines act as a deterrent, comes down to whether the police are able to do that.
Right, but the hotel quarantine policy, Anita, hasn't even come into effect. It's not due to come into effect until next Monday. So people might doubt the sort of practical level of these sorts of policies. What's your view, and do you think the Conservative Party will sign up to this?
Well, I think there's two different things here. There's the questions around testing, and I think actually if the police steps up their visits to people's homes and to make sure that they are isolating and testing, I think that seems like practically it would be possible. And ultimately, we have to remember that the majority of people are following the rules where they can, and the real weakness really has been around self-isolation. So I think it's important that the government sends this signal that it's going to be tough on that, but also that it looks at its support to make sure it's incentivising and encouraging people to actually isolate.
Right. I mean, at a practical level, David, do you think it will work? Is it logistically possible?
I think the jury's out. I'm very strongly in favour, by the way, of the vaccine passport. I can't see any reason why we wouldn't want to do that. And we've really got to look at this being a limited measure for a very limited period of time. And then we need to open up. Otherwise, we're really going to be massive economic and trading problems. Right.
Matt, what do you think about the idea of a vaccine passport?
Well, I think, I mean, to some extent, there is going to be some handover of who's had the jab and when, isn't there? But actually, you're right. What we're putting into place now has to be a short-term fix. We have to find out ways, maybe have to look at that vaccine passport, ways that we can get the doors back open, work out who's had the jab and who can travel.
All right, that's all we've got time for. We'll be back, of course, tomorrow at 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions. But thank you to all of my guests for joining us today, including, of course, Joanna Lumley. From all of us here, bye-bye.